All right, so I had this idea of primitive electronics, and actually, what I wound up picking is sort of a step removed from that, I suppose. But the really primitive electronics would be like the theremin and the really early patch synthesizers, and or musique concrète type stuff being made in the 50s, all of which I'm a big fan of. Instead of choosing anything of that nature, I went for stuff from the late 70s and early 80s that kind of sounds like cranky electronics. It's like where the machines themselves seem to have a personality that is almost fighting with the human will to dominate them. On that note, I'll just pull out item number one. And we've got the fabulous German Shepherds doing music for sick queers. You know this one, Jackson?
No,
Or
you
for
tried
that
to
matter,
make me buy
Tristan?
that out of the bin. It scared me.
It is kind of scary stuff. They talk about pot ruined their lives and unhealthy unhealthy appetite for the company of underage boys. I'm assuming that it's an act, but they hit all the right wrong notes. I mean, we've got Communist Control, Armageddon Man, Love Me Preacher, and Hitler's Child taking up side A. So
Okay. Yeah, that's a bit. They're doing a bit.
I would think so. But it's got these great sort of cranky drum machines that are just kind of plodding along, and this gnarly synthesizer that just sounds vicious and untamed. And there's kind of a little tiny voice warbling on top. It's kind of like a combination. It's like a danceable White House meets Big Black sort of sound. Maybe
Okay.
it's not that at all, but it's really good, and the machines sound angry, which is my was my main criterion in making my choices. So that's item number one. Uh, Item two is from all the way across the Atlantic in Europe, Metal Urbain. And despite the fact that they're called urban metal, they're not metal at all. They've got another kind of willful drum machine throttling forward great song titles like Snuff Movie, Pop Garbage, and Ultraviolence. There's also, I'm translating here freely from the French. But anyways, it's angry shouted vocals of a very much of a punk variety on top of teetering electronics. So there's no drums, there's no bass, there's no guitar in this band. It's all late 70s punk aggro stuff, but with unconventional instrumentation, but a punk length songs.
Great cover.
Metal urbain. And then finally, coming back to these shores and the East Coast, we've got a band named after a band mentioned in Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange, a made-up band before it became a real band. Ike Yard for broadcast, but a fact a second. And basically, this record sounds like your HVAC system having a sort of boogie down funk session. It's, I don't know how else to describe it. It is extremely robotic and inorganic, but it kind of throbs and pulses like what's keeping your house lit and warm. So cold-blooded. It's like a cold-blooded North American version of Kraftwerk, of like a model era Kraftwerk. Prior to this, they've released a great record called Night After Night, which actually has somewhat more conventional instrumentation that's also worth checking out. But this is all machines. Um, and so all three of these records conjure up a mood of grumpy inorganic life, something that's not carbon based.
How would you describe the vocals? Oh, the
It kind of sounds like somebody trying to keep their mouth closed during interrogation.
okay.
It's not very expressive. Yeah, all of these records conjure up an even earlier era because I mean they were made I think in the age of sequencers and some they all have a raw edge that is that harkens back to another era.
Purposeful primitivism.
Purposeful primitivism, I like that. So, all right, Chris, what you got?
All right. This took me a little while to figure out, actually, this one. Mine are definitely not synthesizer records necessarily, or at least the majority of them are not. I'll start off with this though. Cabaret Voltaire's Red Mecca. I think it's from 1980 or 81. This is maybe the last release of theirs that could still properly be classified as an industrial record, which is to say it's still pretty experimental. It's a much easier listen than some of the earlier stuff. Yeah, I'm actually sort of partial to some of the later ones, like the Crackdown and Microphonies. That's a cool record. The stuff that is a little bit further down the path to just being, an electronic dance record, those have great beats on them. And, they're still somewhat sinister, but this one's got more sinister on it. And it's a cool record, too. Mm-hmm. Second one, Schoolie D's Saturday Night, the record, or the album. Schoolie D, I guess he's often referred to as like the father of gangster rap or something like that, which you can kind of get from these songs. But he was a hell of a rapper. I sort of discovered this just totally by accident when I was in, I don't know, high school or whatever. This came out 1987, relatively pretty early in hip hop's evolution. And it definitely sounds like it. The drum machine sounds super primitive. I mean, the whole record sounds pretty primitive, but also just um, incredibly catchy too. And as I said, Scooby-Doo's a great rapper. That's a great photo right there. Um, but these are basically all just tales about. He was from Philadelphia, and he rapped pretty much exclusively about chasing women and shooting people and selling drugs. There was a sort of cheeriness to it. It sounded a little bit tongue in cheek. I'm not sure how much of it was or not, but anyway, great record. And finally, I chose this King Tubby record or a compilation. One of these really good compilations that Blood and Fire put out, I don't know, 20 years ago or so. These are from the 70s. I could have chosen different King Tubby records. I could have chosen, Lee Perry, the Black Ark stuff. Could have chosen a ton of dub records. I just happened to be partial to this one. The work King Tubby did in the studio. These guys achieved pretty incredible things with some really, really primitive technology. And they were doing shit that like nobody else, it really even occurred to anybody else to do. So that's pick number 3. Over to you, Jackson.
The way I see the evolution of electronics is it sort of concurred with modernism, proto-modernism, modernism, and beyond, where you have musique concrète in classical music, where tape manipulations were occurring. So it's like pure sound effects, other instruments recorded on tape and then slowed down, reversed, cut up, collaged. So that was very influential in this development. Theremin, invented in 1919, very sophisticated instrument where the electronic field is controlled volume on the left and pitch on the right, and two sensors. On de Olin, which is a keyboard instrument, the first synthesizer in 1939. And that sort of launched this whole series of innovations where people are playing with electronic organs and different primitive synthesizers. And then in 63, you have the Buchla, and here's a schematic of it. It's not one of my choices, which it's a synthesizer that has no keyboard. And then shortly after that, the Moog synthesizer, which does have a keyboard. I happened to pick three that have synthesizers. My first choice, the soundtrack to Forbidden Planet. So this, well, a little bit about the movie. This was the first Hollywood movie, sci-fi film that was trying to be high budget, but it really wasn't because it was made for about $1 million. So it was sort of categorized as a B movie, but it was a serious endeavor. They used the Tempest, Shakespeare's Tempest, as the storyline. And they didn't quite know what to do with the soundtrack, but they did end up commissioning two artists that were involved in music concrete, Lewis and E. Barone. And they made their own synthesizers and also used that music concrete technique of cutting up the tape. So they ended up with a solid synthesizer record, standalone. It's classic. It's hard to listen to. But after a few listens, it actually goes down like mother's milk. It's smooth and creamy, like after three listens. But it's like it's a lot of it's improvised because they had that flexibility of cutting up the tape and resequencing the parts. It's covered as far as sound effects for a sci-fi movie, which aren't the most interesting parts, but they go into these passages that I'm calling space hauntings that are really just fabulous. It's just the perfect blend of bleeps and bongs and sweeps and all the things that electronic synthesizers can do. It was also nominated for an Academy Award, but was not awarded. Oh, second. So this would be from my Outsider collection, Outsider Folk. This is a Mexican record, but not really, because let's see, how do you pronounce that name? It's up here. It's by Tito. It's from 1977. It's pronounced Quetzalcoatl, which means feathered serpent. And it is a story about Aztec history before Hispanic culture kicked in. This guy is it's a bedroom recording, and he's using Mini Moog, the ARP Odyssey, and a bunch of other things like guitars and basses and things like that. But predominantly, it's the synthesizer sound that pervades. It's subtle and varied. It's a slow reveal. It sort of makes you come to it, pastoral, but ultimately it's mystical and mesmerizing. So it's a classic. It's in reissue.
Is there any vocal component to it?
There is actually the last quarter of it has a spoken word, bizarre spoken word in indigenous Aztec. This comes from the genre of krautrock or Kammermusik, German music. It is Cluster from 1977. So I am going in chronological order here. Supposedly their fifth release on the Sky label. So Cluster is Mobius on piano and well, keys in general, and synthesizers, and Rodelius, who makes the rhythms and the textures. So they may also made their own signal generators, which create the wave shape, and oscillators that create the pitch or the notes that are being played. It's very sophisticated, certainly influenced by Kraftwerk, but taken in a different direction. It's much more sparse, it's more minimal, it's more relaxed. And there is some piano. The whole second side is, well, the name of the album is Grosses Wasser. The whole second side is that piece. And there's a lot of piano at the beginning, and then it sort of disappears. It's predominantly electronics. And then it sort of goes into a classical mode, sort of Renaissance melodies, and ultimately a very satisfying listen. Some of the parts are R&B rhythms, which is interesting, and I think a lot of the Germans did that, like American R&B rhythms done with synthesizers. And some of it's motoric, but not very much. That's that really consistent, insistent backbeat of the krautrockers. There's a lot of yelling and grunting in parts, but it's very artful. So if you like your music relaxed, this is for you. Or should I say, relax, man, relax.
We Raxin. 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 We Raxin.